Vanessa Beeley is a Lebanon-based reporter and writer. Vanessa, thank you so much for coming back on to KLA for another interview.
No, thanks for inviting me.
For anyone in our international audience who may be unfamiliar with your work, could you give us a brief summary of your reporting work and tell us why you made the Middle East the focus of your efforts?
I'll try to keep it brief. I'm an entirely independent journalist based in the Middle East, really for the last 10 years, living in Syria from 2019 until 2024, up until the very last day when Damascus fell to the Al-Qaeda rebranded forces of al-Jolani, or as he's now known, Ahmed al-Shara. Now I'm based in Beirut in Lebanon, which of course is on a daily basis under attack also by the Israeli forces. Prior to living in Syria and working in Syria and being on the majority of the front lines during the Syrian Arab Army operations to liberate areas of Syria from the Takfiri forces backed by the US, Israel, Turkey, the UK and the EU. Prior to that, I was also in Gaza in 2012, 2013, 2012 under one of the former Zionist aggressions against Gaza. And during 2013, I spent time in Gaza and also in Egypt during the kind of Morsi era, and then during the protest, during which, of course, he was effectively deposed. Prior to that, I guess my interest in the Middle East came from my dad, who was British ambassador and one of the most well-known Arabists within the British government from really pre-Second World War onwards. And so I guess I just grew up with the kind of Middle East discussions and discourse at the table, and also just really passively being involved in my dad's work until he died in 2001. So that really is the background, very briefly.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to begin this interview with a quote from an article I just read. I think it was Glenn Greenwald's latest, and the quote goes like this: Americans are being bashed over the head with the moral imperative of fighting a new American regime change war. Parenthetically, the exact type of war that President Trump was elected to avoid. This time in Iran, a country 3 times the population of Iraq. Would you agree with the sentiment in that quote?
Well, absolutely. If you go back to the early 2000s and the Brookings Institute paper, The Path to Persia, if people read that paper, and it doesn't take very long, they'll understand exactly what the US has been planning, of course, in partnership with Israel for the last, let's say, well, really since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Which effectively toppled the Shah, which was very much a regime under the control of the West, and going even further back to the CIA, MI6 toppling of Mossadegh, who really had nationalized the oil industry in Iran, and so on, Operation Ajax. So, but we should really expect this after the fall of Syria, after Libya, after Iraq. It's very clear that the United States is absolutely all out to basically secure the national security of Israel, not necessarily of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Now, within that quote, he says, bashed over the head with a moral imperative. And I wonder if it's okay if I introduce sort of a personal anecdote here about something that happened in church the day before yesterday. And in my Sunday church, there's always a prayer time, and we can have all kinds of prayers, prayers of thanks, prayers of supplication, etc. Anyway, when I raised my hand and I said, I would like to pray for our nation and our government. And I said, I would like to pray that cooler heads prevail, that they come in and somehow convince the administration, convince the war hawks that this this belligerent warring nation comes to their senses before we engage in yet another war in Iran. And almost immediately, someone on the other side of the aisle, in retort, he says, well, if God deems it necessary that there be a war. No, he prefaced this with this. I've been reading lately about the persecution and oppression of Christians in Iran. And so he set this up as if these people need to be liberated. And he says, if God deems this a necessary war, I'd like to pray for the protection of our people in uniform, all of our sailors and pilots and so forth heading to Iran right now. Do you think this is an example of Americans being bashed on the head with a moral imperative? We're just doing the same thing again, are we not?
I'd like to retort to that with an anecdote of having lived in Syria for 10 years. And I can say that General Qasem Soleimani, who was assassinated by President Trump in 2020, was the number one warrior against ISIS, not the US. The US was involved in the creation of ISIS. I mean, we can come on to that. Not only that, he was responsible for training the Christian National Defense Forces inside Syria to defend themselves against the Takfiri Wahhabi fanatics who besieged many of the Christian communities, both Orthodox and Catholic, in all regions of Syria. And in fact, when there was a double suicide bombing attack on a Lebanese Maronite village in the northeast of Lebanon in 2016, if my memory serves me right, and I went to the village immediately after, it was Hezbollah that is considered, it's considered as a proxy of Iran. It isn't a proxy of Iran. It's an independent resistance movement that is allied with Iran. It's a very different thing. And it was Hezbollah that came to the defense of that Christian community, surrounded the village and protected it from the various Wahhabi fanatics within the refugees that had come into Lebanon from Syria. And fast forward to 2022, when I myself spent a lot of time in Iran after the Mahsa Amini orchestrated protests and riots back then. And I visited the Armenian Christian communities in Isfahan, who are, they're not being persecuted. Iran is inclusive. Syria was inclusive. Who is responsible for the persecution of Christians and displacement of Christians from this region? It is the West, and that includes the US. Why? Because they want the field left open for effectively what is a Karbala II scenario, where Shia Muslim is going to be pitted against the extremist Sunni Muslim factions. They don't want the Christians as a buffer in the region, and that has been ongoing for decades. There are plenty of documented papers on it, academic papers on it. Why did Canada, for example, offer fast-track visas to Christians from Syria and European countries also? Because they want the Christians to leave the area. So who is persecuting the Christians in this region? And they're Arab Christians. They're not Western Christians. They belong to this region and they want to stay in this region. They consider themselves to be part of the fabric of this region, but they are literally being driven out by the regime change projects that introduce these Al-Qaeda type elements that, of course, consider Christians as infidels. Look at what's happening now in Syria. Christians are being persecuted under the Trump-backed Jolani government, and Trump has very recently, in the last 48 hours, admitted that he put Jolani in power. I would argue with that because MI6 was heavily involved in it, and a number of other countries were also heavily involved in the final downfall of Damascus and of Syria as a sovereign nation. So no, I entirely disagree with this statement. And if people, I guess I would question the background to that person's Christianity, because there are a number of, let's say, Zionist-leaning Christians in the United States, many of whom are in Trump's administration, who will uphold this kind of narrative because of their allegiance to Israel. So I'm not saying that he is, but I'm saying that that's kind of a common narrative that I'm hearing from that faction in the United States.
Yes, and it seems to be a narrative that it is a bit ignorant of history and ignorant of our previous wars, because I don't think Christians experienced a net increase in safety and so forth after what we did in Afghanistan, Libya, Lebanon, Iraq, and Gaza. In fact, when you say that they want the Christians out, is this akin to the Israel wanting the Jews out of the surrounding nations? And haven't the Jews been living in relative peace in Iran for centuries?
Yes, and in fact, that's an interesting point, because again, in 2022, I visited Jewish communities also in Isfahan. And I actually asked them why had they not basically moved to Israel during the creation of the state of Israel. And they said, because we belong here. We are effectively Iranian Jews. Iran is our country, and we feel safe and we feel protected here. So exactly the opposite. And I believe, I can't remember exactly when, but there was an incentive by Israel actually offering a financial incentive for Iranian Jews to move to Israel. And effectively it was turned down. They didn't want to leave. And I think it's the second largest Jewish population in the world after Israel.
Wow. That's amazing. I would be surprised that it's even larger than the Jewish population in the United States. You talking absolute numbers or?
Yeah, as far as I know, double check it, but that's what I was told when I was in Iran. It's a very big population.
That's amazing. Okay, thank you for that background. Now let's talk about the situation right now. If we are on the cusp of war, but before I get to that question, I want to ask you, speaking of the demonstrations in Iran, which have been in the news so much, apparently it's still trending like crazy. This 36,000 number, etc. Are foreign influences behind the demonstrations in Iran, or are they grassroots and purely Iranian?
You know, this is kind of textbook strategy for the intelligence agencies in the West. We saw it in Syria. Alleged security forces crackdowns on peaceful protests, when the reality was that the so-called peaceful protesters were killing not only security forces who were unarmed for the first 6 months of those protests by decree of the president and the government in Syria, so that they didn't harm their own people in Syria. But even fire brigades, civil defenses were coming under attack just because they were trying to keep peace among the different factions in the protests back in Syria. And effectively, from what I understand from talking to many different people inside Iran, the protests began peacefully around the start of January 2026. And they were really among the bazaris, as they're called. So the people that run the bazaars, that have the shops inside the bazaars in Tehran and across Iran. And I met many of them again. I think it was in Isfahan and in Shiraz. And even back in 2022, of course, they were fed up with the economy. They were fed up to a degree with the isolationism, the fact that they couldn't export to everywhere in the world. They had very limited availability of trade and buyers for their products, right? And there was very little tourism because they had depended for a long time.
Because of the embargo, correct?
Yeah, of course. Who is isolating Iran? It's the United States and the entire cabal through sanctions, but also through isolationism. And with Trump putting tariffs on anyone that buys Iranian oil, et cetera, et cetera. And so the economic pressure had reached a point where really the bazaris were going out on the streets and saying, like, we need some help. because we're struggling economically. And at that point, the security forces, the police and the Basij, as they're called, the kind of local security forces, really, volunteer security forces, were actually marching with the Bazaris because they're also on probably among the lowest wages in Iran, right? So it was incredible. If you look at actual videos of the early protests, you'll see how friendly and jovial they all were. And they have a point. Everyone accepts that they have a point. But of course, the entire point of sanctions is to incapacitate a state to be able to improve living conditions inside Iran. Having said that, I do want to make a very quick point. When I went in 2022, coming from Syria, which was being crippled by economic sanctions, war, US occupation of its oil reservoirs and its agricultural areas, I was shocked by how well looked after Iranians are. I went to some of the poorest areas in Tehran. The houses were boiling hot in midwinter. They had free gas, free electricity, 24/7. The streets were incredibly clean. Fuel for your car, of course, was ridiculously cheap. I think we filled up the kind of the camper van we were traveling in with about $3. And everyone has state electricity and gas and water. Of course, there are problems with water now. And if we have time, we can come on to that because I do actually think that's part of the hybrid war against Iran. And then basically what happened was, I think it was for 3 days, so the 8th, 9th, 10th of January, the violent rioters started joining the protests, but they were effectively attacking protesters also. They were attacking anyone that disagreed with them. Many of them were heavily armed. Many of them conducted some really awful attacks on the security forces. There were multiple stabbings, dismemberment of corpses, burning of corpses, burning of mosques, burning of essential infrastructure, the murder of doctors, nurses, medical staff, the burning of hospitals. I mean, which Iranian in their right mind is going to come out on the streets and destroy the infrastructure that they all need? This doesn't, just as in Syria, this doesn't make any sense.
Right. Does this make sense as a provocation? Just like, say, 25 years ago with the WTO protests in Seattle, where they had the Black Bloc intervene to get the violence going. Are they trying to provoke a reaction from the Iranian regime in order to get a video-worthy moment for international media?
Well, they were basically trying to destabilize Iran internally and turn the people against the regime or against the government. And effectively what happened, if you look at the numbers that you're talking about, which are insane, like 36,000, I've seen various numbers circulating on social media and in the media. But let's have a look at the actual organization. The main organization that is producing this information is an organization called the Human Rights Activists in Iran, or of Iran. And they're human rights activist news agency. So HRAI and HRANA. And I've seen every single media outlet from the United States, from Britain, the BBC, Channel 4, all citing this organization for the numbers that they're then disseminating. Now, you would assume human rights activists of Iran would be based in Iran, right, and reporting from the streets of Iran. That's an acceptable assumption from anyone. But none of these media outlets did due diligence, because guess where this organization is based? Fairfax, Virginia. And it's funded by the National Endowment, National Endowment for Democracy, NED, which is known to be a CIA asset and a CIA outreach agent.
Yeah, isn't Fairfax, Virginia, spook central in the United States?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, but people are just simply, it is the responsibility of the media. I mean, any media outlet should first of all look at the source. But they're not doing that, of course, just as they didn't do it in Syria, just as they relied on CIA and MI6 assets in Syria for their information, which they just regurgitated without any verification whatsoever. That's exactly what they're doing in Iran. And even if you look at media outlets like Iran International, again, you would think Iran International, it's Iranian-based. No, it's Saudi-funded. It has studios in Israel. And it's actually effectively owned. The director is based in London.
That's amazing. You know, I looked at, I typed in a web search about what's going on in Iran today, and Time Magazine and a number of local TV stations around the country, they all sourced Iran International as the authoritative source on all this.
Yeah, it's either Iran International or BBC Persia, and I don't have to say too much about the BBC because, you know, they're responsible, in my opinion, for what is now happening in Syria, just as much as the British government is, just as much as the US government is, because the media is effectively an extension of the intelligence apparatus in all of these countries, and it is basically channeling foreign policy strategy and intelligence operations through its media outlets to, as you said, to brainwash people into believing that they're fighting the just war in whatever country that they know nothing about, in a region that probably the majority of them can't even pinpoint on a map, to be honest.
Yeah. You know, there's one really bizarre development in this reporting on Iran, and that is, I get this, I haven't researched it myself, but I get this from my team at KLA, and they said that Mossad came out and told the Iranians they're on their side, that, quote, "We are with you on the ground."
Yeah.
What sort of universe do they think that that's going to be a positive? Do the Iranians not know anything about Mossad? Did this really happen, and what's going on? Why would they do that?
No, they came out very publicly. And actually, if you look at Netanyahu's speeches for, I think, about the last 10 years, he's effectively inciting regime change in Iran. He's telling Iranians, look, if you overthrow the regime, we'll lift the sanctions, we'll help you develop, we'll do X, Y, Z to make your life so much better because your regime won't be spending all this money on foreign wars. Well, hold on a minute. Isn't Israel probably the most sort of warlike entity in this entire region that has kept the entire region in a state of war, chaos, and destabilization since its inception, right? But this is all getting projected onto Iran. So it's been very clear. Of course it's clear. And I mean, they put out a very recent documentary on how Mossad was training the Kurdish separatists to overthrow the government in Iran. So they're blatant about it. They have absolutely no qualms about saying that we want this government gone. And we want Iran to be basically balkanized along the lines of the clean break doctrine from 1996, 1997. They want the entire region, including Iran, fractured, balkanized, and carved up, because that makes it so much easier for Israel to both expand, not only expand from a settlement perspective, but to expand economically and from a sphere of influence perspective.
And they do not want, I mean, you're answering the question that was coming up next, which was, what exactly does Israel and the American administration in Washington, D.C. want at the core? And I think you just answered part of it. They don't want any sort of stable government or country with any kind of military strength. They basically, if they can't have the land, they want the people around them to be defenseless and weak, correct?
Yep. They don't want any independent sovereign nations. And that's why, of course, they've destroyed Iraq. And if we go back to General Wesley Clark, he named the 7 countries with Iran at the end. Syria is basically pivotal to the breaking of the spine of the resistance axis. What do I mean by the resistance axis? I'm talking about the pro-Palestine, anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist axis, which goes from Iran to Yemen. Both of those, of course, are state resistance actors, to Iraq, where you have non-state actors and some state actors because the popular mobilization forces have been absorbed into the official Iraqi military. Syria, of course, was a resistant state. Previously, it was a sovereign nation. It had independent banking. It wasn't in debt to the IMF and the World Bank. And it had a policy which basically refused to abandon justice for Palestine. Then you have Lebanon, non-state actor, which is Hezbollah and the Amal movement. Again, they're very inclusive of other resistance movements, even Christian movements here in Lebanon. So I don't want people to get the impression this is just all an Islamic resistance movement. It isn't. It's inclusive in all those countries of every single sector of society if they are opposed to Israel, the occupation of Palestine, and any imperialist projects. And then, of course, you have Palestine. If you're going to say that this is a Shia Islam thing, the resistance in Palestine is Sunni. Absolutely, yes. Majority Sunni. And yet Iran is defending Palestine because Palestine is the issue that is core to its foreign policy, basically. Right.
Right.
And so what does Israel want? You're absolutely right when you pinpointed the fact that Israel doesn't want any independent or even not independent, even, basically allied with Israel, like Saudi Arabia. It hasn't signed the Abraham Accords, but it is still working. It was created by the British to work in lockstep with Israel, just like UAE, to a lesser degree Qatar. Qatar is more wedded to Turkey, but was still heavily invested in the takedown of Syria because someone told me, it was actually the Venezuela ambassador who was formerly in Syria, now in Lebanon. And he told me he remembers, I think about 20 years ago, and I can't remember the name of the Mossad director who was talking about it. And he said, someone said to him, we should take out Lebanon. He said, no. We have to take out Syria because if we take out Syria, the whole axis is weakened to a point where then we can take out Lebanon. There's no problem. So this has always been the plan for Syria to be taken out completely. And what happened, I was still in Damascus the night that Jolani's forces entered Damascus and surrounded my house. And at that point, Israel started bombing all of Syria's military installations with bunker buster bombs because there was no Syrian army to fire air defense missiles at the incoming missiles. So they could do what they wanted. They destroyed the Navy. They destroyed the Air Force. They destroyed air defense. So they left Syria completely defenseless, actually, in any kind of kinetic war. The same, to an extent, they normalized with Egypt back in 1979. And until now, they've ensured that Egypt stays out of the Sinai militarily. Yes. Jordan, of course, is pretty much a vassal state still of Great Britain, so it's not necessarily going to be a big threat to Israel. Saudi Arabia, I think, is at some point going to be in the crosshairs because it's doing these ostensible deals with Trump on supplying not only defense capability, but offense capability. And that long term is not going to be acceptable to Israel. Turkey also, I think, is going to be a target. We're already seeing a kind of a fracture and fissures appearing in the relationship between Turkey and Israel because you've got competition between Erdogan's Ottoman empire, neo-Ottoman empire ambitions and Israel's expansion ambitions. So at some point, in my opinion, there is going to be a degree of clash or regime change in Turkey or some degree of pushing back against Turkey and containing it within its borders and reducing its capability to militarily challenge Israel, not now, but in the future. And yes, this is incredibly important for them. That's why they've been pushing for the disarmament of Hezbollah. They're blackmailing the Lebanese government, and both blackmailing and incentivization is coming from Saudi Arabia. Blackmailing is coming from Israel and the US to disarm the resistance. The same in Iraq. Yemen, Trump tried to go up against them. Actually, he had to withdraw after, I think it was about 3 days, because the Pentagon threw their hands up in horror and said, you're spending too much money and you're not achieving anything. So get out, because we need these missiles, whether it's for Iran or China, we don't know. And now, of course, they consider if they can weaken or destroy Iran to the extent that they can cut off the head of this resistance axis. And by that, I'm not saying that all these resistance actors are proxies of Iran. That's a very important point to make. They're allies of Iran, but Iran is huge. It's vast. It has enormous capabilities of weapon production, missile development, and so on. And therefore it is, to a degree, the head of that resistance axis. And so now that's what they need to achieve, because once in their minds Iran falls, then it's easy for them to sweep the rest of the Middle East or West Asia of those resistance actors.
Amazing. Well, Vanessa, you're doing a really good job of anticipating my questions. And you were first to bring up Wesley Clark. And Iran happens to be the last of these 7 countries, is it not?
Yes.
We've done our job on the other 6. So, and you just answered why they want to go after Iran for the final, the 7th. What, beyond what you just mentioned, is there going to be any resistance to the Borg, let's call it, the cult, as David Icke calls it, if Iran goes down and there's no more resistance in the Middle East to America, to Israel? What happens then?
That's, I think that's the $1 million question. It's the reason for the anxiety for the people here in Lebanon, for the people in Iraq, Yemen, to a degree. Yemen is kind of, I put that to one side because Ansarullah as a movement is extraordinary. What they've achieved, despite being under aggression since 2015 themselves for the last 11 years and under severe blockade and sanctions, starvation, lack of medical care, etc. And yet they were still able to close the Red Sea to shipping to the Zionist entity during, the genocide is still ongoing. It's been ongoing for 100 years, but let's say since the 7th of October. Right. And it is still happening. Palestinians are still being slaughtered in Gaza and West Bank, but we can possibly come on to that a bit later in the talk. But I think the scary thing is for me, and when I look at, and it's something that I study a lot and research a lot, the infiltration of, for example, Unit 8200, the Zionist spy unit, into all sectors of British society, whether it's health, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's the Ministry of Defense, who store all their information on Oracle, which is basically Zionist owned, right? You've had Moshe Cohen, the former director of Mossad, saying, every phone in the world today has a bit of Israel in it. And that's after they killed and maimed 3,000 people here in Lebanon, the majority civilians, children, women, in their homes through the pager attack, and then gave the Golden Pager Award to Trump. I mean, it's just pure psychopathy as far as I'm concerned.
Was that Golden Pager a warning to him?
Possibly. I don't know. I mean, I can't speculate on that. I mean, he seemed quite happy to receive it. And I didn't see him objecting to, the mutilation of 3,000 people here in Lebanon. And I have to say that was horrifying because many of them at that time were brought to hospitals in Damascus. And I had doctors who'd gone through 14 years of war and seeing awful injuries in floods of tears over that. A mother who was begging the doctor to take her eyes to give them to her daughter because she had an entire life ahead of her and she was completely blinded. So, I don't have any great sympathy whether it was given as a warning or not. I don't care. The fact is that Trump signed off on everything that has happened to the people of this region, whether he was in government or not. He paved the way for what happened in Syria in his first administration. He picked up from where Biden left off. And in fact, it increased under his watch in this second administration because he took any kind of block of arms supply and support for Israel, which enabled even more slaughter. To give you another story from here in the last 3 days, he's currently a civilian, right? And he lives in the south. And of course, everyone in the south, just like in Gaza, everyone is Hamas. Everyone who lives in the south of Lebanon is Hezbollah or connected to Hezbollah and therefore a legitimate target. He'd gone with his wife to his wife's parents' house. And while he was there, he received a phone call from an Israeli who said to him, okay, you have a choice. You die with your family or you die alone, but you're going to die. So make a choice. He basically made the choice. He kept the family in the house. He got in his car. He drove away and they killed him. That's the mentality that people need to understand that we're dealing with. That's just one story, and then look at what the Takfiris are doing in Syria to the minorities there, to the Alawites, to the Druze, to the Christians, now to the Kurdish civilians. And so for me, I think when there is no resistance left in West Asia, when there's no barrier for that wave of psychopathic Satanism, I can't describe it any other way. Yeah. There's a million stories I could tell you from inside Syria. And just consider that Trump has just enabled the release of ISIS in northeast Syria. So he's increased the number of terrorists in Syria by about 20,000. And that's a conservative estimate.
Yeah.
And those are being fostered and armed and equipped by the United States. What happens when this region, if it does, falls to Israel and the United States? Where do they go?
Yeah.
Who's going to receive the blowback of all of this interference in this country, in this region?
Yes. Yes, and you hear the word regime change coming from the U.S. regime. You hear it coming from Syria. We need regime change in Iraq, in Iran, regime change in Iran. Isn't the Syria example? It should be like the talking point for for peace lovers like you and me. The talking point should be, this is what you get with regime change, should it not? Just point to Syria before we go into Iran.
Well, you don't even before Syria, how's women's rights doing in Afghanistan?
Yeah.
That was the main reason that the U.S. went into Afghanistan. You remember all the Avaz women's rights adverts that were on kind of buses and all over the place? We're going to liberate women in Afghanistan. How are they doing now under the Taliban? If you look at Libya, it's just a drug-fueled sex slave, sex trade hub now, right? Iraq. Economically, how is Iraq doing? And that's despite the alleged billions of aid that poured in after the second Gulf invasion, after the second Iraq invasion, which of course, anybody can look up what Paul Bremer did. And all of this money coming in that didn't go to the people, it went to the ruling elite in Iraq to keep them happy, keep them in the U.S. pocket, continue to allow the U.S. to occupy Iraqi territory, right, militarily. And then look at Syria, exactly the same thing. Tom Barrack is doing exactly the same thing. all these nefarious pledges and financial investment that's coming into Syria, where is it going? No one's got electricity. Everyone's unemployed. Everyone is starving. No one has any kind of dignity. There's no safety. There's no law. There's no security.
And this is all according to plan.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yep.
Because they don't want, and that's the point I also want to make. What is happening here? What is happening in Gaza? I mean, now you've got the introduction of digital surveillance. So you're bringing the technocracy into Gaza. It already existed in Hebron in the West Bank, which is one of the most surveilled areas in Palestine. And vindictively surveilled, right? Malevolent. It's not for security. It's to kill Palestinians.
Yeah.
That's going to come everywhere in the world. You're seeing it now with the introduction of Palantir into American security systems, into ICE. They were brought in by Trump. And they're all Zionist-affiliated agencies.
Okay, to kind of finish up with Iran, my last question on Iran would be, how much support does the Iranian government have from the Iranian people? We're led to believe that they're at odds.
Anyone should go to a viable Iranian channel on social media and look at the celebrations of the 47th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution and the millions who came out on the streets. Students, workers, even people who are opposed to the government came out on the streets to support the government because they understand that Iran is being targeted. And the same happened in Syria in the early days. No one filmed the hundreds of thousands that came out in support of President Assad. Of course they didn't. That's not newsworthy. That doesn't support American and Israeli foreign policy. So they're not going to show that. But there are multiple images, even after the protests, or during the protests, actually, there were huge numbers. I mean, I am talking millions in Tehran and in cities across the whole of Iran. Even some areas which people told me, gosh, I mean, people don't usually even come out of their houses. It's cold and they don't want to come out on the streets. But even in these cities and villages like Mashhad, for example, there were tens of thousands out in support of the government and the military.
Yes. Okay, moving on, Vanessa. Briefly, what is your prognostic? It seems like Gaza is on the back burner. We're all focused on Iran now, so we've temporarily forgotten about Gaza, and by extension, we've forgotten about the West Bank, which is experiencing things very similar to what's going on in Gaza. Ring our bells, shake our head a little. What should we be also focused on at the same time as we prepare for a war in Iran concerning Gaza in the West Bank?
You know, I mean, I say people talk about a two-state solution, and I've always opposed it. I've always said it's not viable. Even in 1936, the Peel Commission dismissed it as not being viable at all, despite, of course, being aligned with British policy at the time.
Yes.
But what territory is left? What stone are you going to put? What remnants of Palestinians are you going to build a two-state on? You know, we look at Gaza now, and since Trump's ridiculous board of peace, which is clearly intended to replace the United Nations to some degree. When we look at the so-called peace plan, what does it mean? It just means really the final solution, the elimination of any resistance, but also of the majority of Palestinians. Israel hasn't stopped bombing. It hasn't stopped starving them. It isn't allowing any or a trickle of humanitarian aid in. Nothing, as far as I'm aware, has got in through Rafah. And what is the intention of the Peace Board and the members of the so-called Peace Board, which is kind of to some degree one of the executive bodies, I think, is being headed up by Tony Blair, who was responsible alongside Bush of the destruction of Iraq and former Yugoslavia, and was ridiculously made Middle East so-called peace envoy for a number of years, and is sort of roundly hated.
Isn't Tony Blair on the Gaza Peace Board?
Yeah, exactly. And effectively, what is the plan? And I've been saying this from the beginning, is to, and again, people have to remember that the Gaza model is what is going to be rolled out globally, in my opinion, with the upcoming rise of the technocracy and so on. And effectively what it is, Gaza will be made into a link in the India-Middle East economic corridor, which will go from Mumbai through the Arab Gulf states. Gaza will be made into a sort of Dubai-style free trade zone. Palestinians that remain will be kept in labor camps, so they'll be basically kept in concentration camps, right? And the digital surveillance is going to ensure that they only get fed if they provide biometric security identification. There'll be elements that they're suggesting to carve Gaza up into security zones, effectively controlled by a number of countries, the majority of which, of course, have access to what I call the Wahhabi fanatical military, whether it's Kosovo, Indonesia, I can't remember all of the countries that are intended to make up the security forces. So effectively, they'll be aligned with Israel to a large degree, because as we know, Israel has been funding and arming ISIS elements in Gaza to attack Hamas and attack civilians there as well. So they're using them as a proxy, both in Syria, also against Iran in the future, and in Gaza. And so Palestinians are not going to have any agency. They're just going to become cheap labor, effectively, while Israel and the United States and that entire cartel is going to steal Palestinian gas, of course, which hasn't yet been explored. And you're quite right in saying that what is happening in West Bank is exactly the same, and it's been ongoing since October the 7th. Now Israel has brought in this new legislation where they can effectively appropriate Palestinian land in Area C, which is really the largest section of territory within the West Bank, because it's divided into A, B, and C. And they'll appropriate Palestinian land as state land. And that way, they're going to actually annex around 83% of Area 3. At the same time, of course, they're increasing absolutely exponentially the building of settlements in Area A and B. And now they're bringing in tanks and fighter jets, military, and so on. So now the genocide is starting. It was already ongoing, but now it's intensifying in the West Bank. So as I say, where is this two-state solution going to end up? You know, the Palestinian Authority, I mean, even Russia negotiates with the Palestinian Authority, and Russia is talking about giving $1 billion in reconstruction for Gaza. To who? To Israel? To the Palestinian Authority, which is a stooge of Israel? To the Trump Peace Board? All of them have the same intention. All of them have the same goal, which is to eliminate resistance, basically eliminate Palestinians, eliminate the Palestinian cause, and subsume Palestine into what will be a sort of hybrid state of Zionist movement power and dominance in the region, backed by the United States and Britain and so on. Yes. And disappear Palestinians.
Amazing. Now you mentioned turning it into a Dubai-style state, and you mentioned gas. I read that there might be a motherlode of natural gas off the shores of Gaza.
Yeah.
Do you know about that?
Yes. Oh gosh, I've forgotten the actual numbers now. But yeah, it is very big. And of course, they're already using the gas on the, not on the Gaza coastline, but the gas that they are using off the Israeli coastline is, of course, Palestinian gas. There's also gas off the coast of Lebanon, which at the moment there's an agreement of exploration by both Israel and Lebanon, if I remember correctly. There's also gas fields off the Mediterranean coast of Syria. So, if we're talking resources, but also one of the most important resources for Israel is water.
Yes.
And of course, that 30% of their water intake comes from the occupied Syrian Golan territory, right? Which Trump has, of course, now gifted to Israel, even though it's Syrian territory.
Yeah.
And the territory within the south of Syria that Israel has occupied also contains some of the largest water resources in the region, supplying not only Syria, but also Jordan, for example.
Yes.
So water is a very, very important resource on the list.
What a savior Trump is. He's given water to Israel. No wonder they minted a gold coin of him with him on one side and King Cyrus on the other, liberating the people of Israel. There's something you talk about called the negotiations trap. And when you talk about what seems to me irreconcilable differences between the two sides, I think these negotiations are meant to have it that way. Like, you put the Palestinians in a situation where there's nothing that our side, that the allies say, offer that is amenable to their interests. This is all on purpose. Our negotiations, have they ever been Camp David, or have they ever been legitimate? And has the American-Israeli side ever gone into these negotiations in good faith?
No, in my opinion, because, if you talk about the Oslo Accords, what happened, I mean, every single step or in the process of negotiation has further reduced Palestinian agency and their ability to actually seek justice, reparations, independence, freedom from, what is an oppressive occupation. Did that improve after the Oslo Agreement, after the Camp David? No, not really. It got worse. And that's the point. After every single, I think it was President Assad actually at the Emergency Arab Summit before the fall of Syria, that he actually said there is no point in negotiating or compromising or making concessions for Israel, because there's no respect for that compromise. There's no respect for those concessions. They just take more. And that is absolutely visible for everyone to see if they're paying attention.
Yes.
And the fact that in the 12-day war, of course, that was a trap. The assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, and, by the way, the commander of the resistance forces in Iraq that were fighting ISIS at the time, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, who I met in 2017 in Iraq, he was also assassinated. They were lured to Baghdad on the basis of negotiations with Saudi Arabia. So, when you talk about negotiations being a trap, they are exactly that. The 12-day war began when the Iranians believed they were still in the negotiation track, not trap. When they were thinking that they were getting somewhere with the negotiations. Now, I will say negotiations are also to buy time. It may be that Iran also needs to buy time. There are air defense equipment coming in from China, not to the extent that people are actually seeing it or saying it is happening, but it is coming in.
Okay.
And Iran needs time to prepare because they're facing not only a kinetic war, they're facing a hybrid war. As I said, Israel is training the Kurdistan separatists on the border with Iran, but also even because, of course, they can cross border quite easily from the north of Iran and the western borders of Iran. And so there is a threat of attacks on the borders with Iran from the west and the northwest. And then you've got Trump building up what I think is potentially as big as the build-up for the 2003 Iraq invasion. That isn't happening for show. A lot of people are kind of saying, well, maybe he's doing it just to put pressure on the negotiations. No, he isn't, because he doesn't want to achieve anything out of the negotiations, because ultimately Iran might agree to only enrich uranium to the point of supplying civilian electricity and so on, which is what they've been intending to do anyway. Because, of course, because of sanctions, electricity is under pressure in Iran, energy is under pressure in Iran, and they need to find a replacement for it. So if you like, America is creating the environment in which Iran has to try and find alternative ways of providing energy to the population. Then Israel is demanding that the missile capability is reduced to 300 kilometers, which is kind of nothing. In other words, that it's no threat to Israel. Well, they're not going to do that. No country is willingly going to decimate their own defense capability, right?
Right.
And so they're, again, just like Hamas, they're being put in a corner where the negotiation demands from the Israeli-American side is crossing Iran's red line every time. But this is a ploy to then say, well, Iran pulled out of the negotiations. They're so intractable.
Yes.
They're not gonna make compromises and so on. Well, to a degree, why should they make compromises? They know the war is coming. It's not going to stop. They know the war is coming. So, of course, they're not going to back down on a number of those points. And why should they? America wouldn't. If the same were reversed and China was building up on America's coastline and they were demanding negotiations with America to reduce their missile capability, their defense capability, their progress and development in technology capability, what would America say? But it becomes very worrying, and I was going to mention Latin America, because we've talked about the Abraham Accords that were brought in by Jared Kushner, and of course Jared Kushner is heavily involved in the development of the waterfront estate in Gaza. He pushed, first of all, the Abraham Accords to basically capture the Arab Gulf states in this region. And Morocco, I think, was one of the first signatories. But let's have a look at Latin America and what's going on there. The fact that Trump kidnapped an acknowledged president of Venezuela. He's now besieging and starving Cuba. And meanwhile, Milei in Argentina has introduced the Isaac Accords in Latin America, right? And America is ensuring that almost every new government across Latin America is right-wing, fascist, Zionist-aligned. And look at the recent wildfires in Patagonia in Argentina that have been blamed by locals upon the Israeli settlers. And going back to the beginning of Zionism, Theodor Herzl actually was eyeing up a number of other countries other than Palestine for Jewish settlers post-Second World War. And one of those was Patagonia, or an area in Patagonia between Chile and Argentina, right? So, and Cyprus. And of course, Israel is effectively now pretty much occupied Cyprus and sort of inveigled itself with the Greek Cypriot government there, and is now pushing back against Turkey in northern Cyprus. So in my opinion, we're already there. It's just not formalized, because to a degree, Israel still has wars to fight here. It still needs to get rid of Iran, so it's still ongoing. But once that is done, there's nothing to stop it. We're already, in my opinion, in that state. And when we look at the incoming surveillance, the incoming CBDC and everything is going to be centralized and everything is going to be surveilled. Nothing is going to be done that isn't watched by the government, basically. Who's bringing all that in? If you look at every single organization, whether it's Palantir, BlackRock, Oracle, and a number of others, they're all infested with former Israeli spy unit 8200 actors. And the directors or the founders are all Peter Thiel of Palantir, Alex Karp, Larry Fink, all of them, Larry Ellison, all of them are self-avowed Zionists, pro-Zionist, pro-Israel.
Yes.
So I think now we're talking about a sort of transnational ruling elite that exist in every single country and are allying on certain aspects. Even China with America. America's weapons industry depends on China that has a monopoly on the rare earth minerals, for example. Russia now is pivoting under Trump back towards the United States. That's very clear. And I think that was clear as being one of the reasons why Syria was abandoned and allowed to fall, because Trump came back into power. And I was saying at the time, that's it. Russia's going to assume that it now has a chance at negotiation, ending the war in Ukraine, and it will withdraw. I didn't think it would happen in this way, but I had already predicted that they would probably start withdrawing assistance for Syria at that point, and it happened. But it happened in a far more dramatic way than I thought, than anyone envisaged it would do, to be honest.
All right. Well, Vanessa Beeley, you've done an excellent job of highlighting what's going on and what we're headed towards. I want to thank you so much for the hour you've given us, and best of luck with your continued work.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure to discuss with you.